Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode I at last return to cinemas, technically for the second time, to see Gerard Butler and Frank Grillo get locked up in Joe Carnahan's Copshop. Fixer Teddy Moretto, played by Frank Grillo, is on the run from the mob who are trying to kill him, and punches rookie cop Valerie Young, played by Alexis Louder, to get himself arrested and hide away. Teddy is booked into the police station in the small town of Gun Creek, but soon the hitman on his tail, Bob Vidic, played by Gerard Butler, intentionally gets himself locked up in the cell beside him. When a second hitman, the psychopathic Anthony Lamb, played by Toby Huss, is also sent after Teddy, the station becomes the setting for a gun-blazing standoff with Valerie caught in the middle. Copshop is based on a screenplay originally written by accountant Kurt MacLeod. This is first produced screenplay and was picked up by director Joe Carnahan, who of course gave it his own rewrite. And Carnahan has a lot of experience in this kind of material. In fact, the premise of competing hitmen going after the same target is very reminiscent of his earlier film Smoking Aces to a much smaller degree. Carnahan produces the movie alongside his regular co-collaborator, actor Frank Grillo. They have a production company together, and they've worked on films like The Grey, Wheelman, Point Blank, and most recently Boss Level. Gerard Butler also produces the movie through his own production company. Now, Copshop filmed in October and November of 2020, so during the COVID-19 pandemic and during the lockdowns, and while it's not a movie that's specifically about that or set during it like some other examples have been, it's definitely a movie that's moulded and shaped by the times in which it was made. In fact, 3 crew members came down with COVID during the production, which meant it had to temporarily cease. But you can definitely see that influence upon the film in numerous ways, and not just in the fact that it's a single location movie about a group of people locked down but with guns. If you're paying attention to it, it's not hard to work out when Copshop was made and how they had to make it. Actors are very rarely in the same frame as each other, often in very tight close-ups, so I suspect a lot of the dialogue exchanges were simply filmed with the actors separately and cut together, and when they do have to share the frame with each other, they're often spaced very far apart. In some instances, they are more than observing their 2-meter distances, unless of course it's absolutely necessary. There's very few extras in the film. There is exactly one scene that has extras, and I suspect that's probably mostly the crew, if nothing else, rather than hiring out extras. And the police station is very empty, even accounting for the fact that this is a small town police department. So you definitely feel those things upon the movie. But Carnahan tries to work around those restrictions and turn them into an aesthetic in of themselves, because you know what else requires people to be spaced very far apart from each other? A standoff. And that's basically what Copshop is from pretty much the first frame, is that it's a succession of standoffs between the characters that just keeps escalating and building and building and building throughout the entirety of the movie. And as such, that kind of heightened artificiality, because everyone is keeping their distance from one another, does actually sort of work in the film's favour to a degree, because it actually comes across more like a stylistic choice than one that was foisted upon the filmmakers. A lot of that comes down to Carnahan's direction. He knows that he is making it a simple, straightforward throwback thriller. You can see this right from the opening titles, which deliberately evoke likes of 70s exploitation actioners, things like John Carpenter's Assault on Precinct 13, which this owes a big debt to. It's the kind of movie that's often called Tarantino-esque, because Carnahan is pulling from the same pool of references as Tarantino is, and as such, it does evoke likes of Tarantino's own Reservoir Dogs or The Hateful Eight, or more recently, Ben Wheatley's Free Fire, which is also very 70s inflected, and they all share in common that they're largely single location movies that have characters with very itchy trigger fingers. And I mentioned The Hateful Eight there, and that's very much on purpose, because Carnahan knows how old school this kind of movie is, and throws in a lot of Western references and iconography. Valerie actually carries a gunslinging quick-draw pistol, which is definitely not police issue, but looks great when you spin the chamber around, and she practices with it constantly, and it looks great, even though obviously it's an artificial detail. And so you've also got characters referencing things like the Alamo, and so on and so forth, and when you combine all of this together, the fact that they had to work around such restrictions, actually, it comes across really stylishly on screen, despite the fact that it was probably really quite hellish to make, I'd imagine, given the circumstances. Carnahan's aware this is thin material, but he tries to milk it for as much tension as he possibly can. The film opens pretty much in progress, with Teddy on the run, but it's not especially clear from who or for what reason, and even after he gets arrested, he ain't saying jack. He's keeping his secrets to himself, if at all possible. But we do get a couple of fleeting glimpses of what his motivations might be. And Carnahan stretches out the first act of this movie. It's very much a slow burn, trying to build suspense and mystery about the characters and build the audience's intrigue and anticipation, because we know that at some point this is going to explode into violence. And this even extends to the likes of Gerard Butler. Butler, aside from a couple of brief glimpses, doesn't even properly enter the movie until about 30 minutes in. And even then, Carnahan suppresses his face for as long as humanly possible until he finally reveals him. So definitely I think the movie builds a lot of atmosphere, especially once Butler and Grillo are in opposite cells from each other. They are almost in the range of killing each other, but they just can't because those bars are in the way. And certainly that also builds a lot of anticipation, because you know at some point the doors are going to open and chaos is going to happen. Unfortunately though, I do think that Carnahan actually drags out this material longer than is absolutely necessary, because the problem is that there is only so much tension that can be built in a movie where 70% of the running time is people sat around in jail cells. And it's this that's the big issue with Copshop. It is a small movie, but it feels small as well. It is claustrophobic because we spend so much of the movie in this one environment, and that works in its favour at first, but after a certain point, it becomes overly familiar, and that means that deflates the atmosphere that Carnahan is trying to set up, and your mind begins to wander, and you start thinking, well, when is the movie actually properly going to get started? At least in my experience. And Copshop, I think, has a problem largely to do with its writing. It's very dialogue heavy, and it's simply not sharp enough. There are some good lines peppered here or there, but not consistently so to hold your attention, in spite of the fact that there is very limited things actually happening on screen. In fact, a lot of the time, it feels like the movie is happening around the cells rather than inside them, in that it feels like most of the story is being worked out by the other cops than what's going on between Teddy and Vidic, which is simply a bunch of stare-downs and antagonizations. In fact, I actually found the movie quickly got repetitious, in that you'd have Vidic trying to engineer ways of getting close to Teddy, or trying to psych out Valerie, and there's only so many times you can do that before it starts becoming a bit samey. And while yes, the movie does eventually expand on what is happening, it's never really truly important. There is some stuff about a DA that has been murdered, and there is a whole conspiracy going on around it, and there are several turncoat characters along the way, but it's not really essential. It doesn't really inform too much of what's happening, because all we need to basically know is bunch of people in a police station shooting at each other. The whys turn out to not really be especially important. And I think that's why the dialogue, I started to tune it out, because it was saying a lot without actually saying anything. And I think there are moments in this movie where characters just expand upon their backstories to no real end. The best example of this is actually Valerie herself. She gets a monologue about her family history, which is definitely a what the hell moment in the movie, not just because of the revelation itself, but also because you go, what on earth does that have to do with anything? And it turns out very little, really. Even after the arrival of Anthony Lamb, little over halfway through, it still feels like the movie doesn't shake up the dynamic enough, despite the fact that Lamb enters the movie guns blazing in a much needed shot of action. But the movie still slows down after that entrance, and Toby Huss definitely goes all or nothing on the cartoon psychopath that he's been handed. In fact, I'm surprised he doesn't try to bite through the walls to get to Teddy and Vidic, considering that he's gnawing on the scenery throughout the entirety of the running time. And yeah, there are some laughs we had from this character. The movie tries to mine a lot of black humour from this cheerful psycho, but he also doesn't feel especially convincing or threatening because of it. In fact, a lot of the time, it feels like a cliche, and I do feel like the character's a little bit too broad for this kind of movie. Maybe some of that is because he doesn't really get to play off the other characters, because most of their interactions are separated by doors and walls from each other, and so the characters never quite spar against each other in the way that you would expect them to. And this extends all the way through the movie, because you would think that Grillo and Butler would play off each other fairly well, but because the two actually spend most of the movie separated, despite being in the same room, that turns out to be not so much the case in execution. Grillo, who appears to be wearing hair extensions, he has his hair up in a man bun for the majority of the movie. He plays Teddy as someone who is desperately self-serving. He is trying to save his own hide no matter what, and also he has a lot of dumb luck. He manages to get out of some very dangerous scrapes to the point where he kind of thinks he's a little bit invincible, and I think that Grillo does well in that role. But it's also exactly what you'd expect from a Frank Grillo performance. He is who he is. Surprisingly though, Butler I actually found to be more subdued than I would expect him to be. There is some moments where he brings some manic intensity to the proceedings, particularly when he beats up his drunken, irritating cellmate and then laughs about it as he draws the cops in. But those are actually surprisingly far and few between. There are moments where almost he drops into the background. There's a lot of the movie where he's just chained to a cell sitting down, and even later on in the movie, it still feels like there are stretches where Butler just kind of drops out of the movie entirely, which is very unusual considering he's the top-billed star, but actually Butler is not really the star attraction here. If this movie has a secret weapon, it's Alexis Louder. Louder is a relative newcomer. She's appeared in small roles in Harriet and the Tomorrow War, but here she's co-lead with Grillo and Butler. And in comparison to them, who are going through familiar motions, Louder feels like someone new and fresh and different. She's a genuinely unpredictable element in this movie, which is fitting for her character. Valerie is a rookie, but also she is the moral compass of the movie, in comparison to all the other characters who are simply just criminals and killers serving their own motivations. She is straight and true. But that doesn't mean necessarily that she's some goody two-shoes. In actuality, just because she has that conscience, she hides it behind this just air of almost unflappable calm. She manages to keep her cool even in the tensest of situations, and also she's very cocky, occasionally to her own detriment, and definitely has a bit of a crazy side to her, as you would expect from someone that carries the weapon that she does. And Louder gets some of the best lines in the script and really delivers them well. Louder is just effortlessly cool throughout the entirety of the movie, and I think that she should have been just the full-blown protagonist here. She is for several chunks of the movie, but then it moves away from her, and honestly, she was the most compelling part of the film. This is the definition of a potentially star-making performance. She steals the movie from everyone else, and that's quite a formidable task, but Louder definitely feels like someone that we should be keeping an eye on, because she is definitely the reason why I think a lot of this movie works as well as it does, and I think it's a detriment when the movie does actually move away from her, particularly in the last act. I feel like the final stretch of the movie actually sidelines Louder so that Butler and Grillo can do their thing, when actually I wanted to see what happened to her character. And eventually she does come back into the proceedings and does actually get a moment to shine. But honestly, if this means that we can get more action movies with Louder in the lead, honestly, I would be all for that. She definitely shows that she has fantastic potential here. In the last 25 minutes or so, the action finally goes off, and once it does, Carnahan does at least deliver. The last stretch of this movie has a lot of well-executed set pieces and some entertaining shootouts that are colourful and explosive, and the tension returns to the film as well somewhat, as now the characters are free to roam around. There's plenty of empty corridors in the police station for them to lurk around, and certainly there are areas in there that turn into labyrinths, particularly the locker room and shower area, where you're never quite sure where characters are in relation to each other until they start exchanging bullets. And once the violence does arrive, it's really brutal and vicious at times, occasionally a little bit to the tone of the movie's detriment, because the tone of the movie is quite comical to a certain extent, but then you'll get these really quite personalised, vengeful moments of retribution that do sit a little bit uncomfortably, but that's kind of Carnahan's thing. If you've seen something like Smoking Aces, you'll probably know what to expect with that kind of stuff. My problem with the action sequences was not really to do with them in of themselves, but more the fact that it took so long to get to them. If the film got to this stretch of the movie earlier, and it was more the last half of the movie instead, I could forgive the fact the movie was so static for so long. But by this point, I was really disengaged with it, so while I appreciated how well they were being made on screen, I didn't fully enjoy the action sequences because I didn't really connect with the characters by that point. And honestly, I found that as Copshop went along and the cast got smaller and smaller, and it wasn't especially big to begin with, but in the last stretch of the movie, you're down to about 5 characters, I found that as it dwindled, it just got less and less interesting, and by the end of it, I kind of actually just wanted it to be over, unfortunately, which is a shame. I wasn't just waiting for the action, I was just waiting for the credits. Do you need to rush out to a cinema to go and see Copshop? Absolutely not. If anything, the fact that it was playing in a cinema only amplified its flaws for me. It wasn't just that it was small, it was that it was flimsy. It didn't feel like there was enough material here, and certainly I felt that having my full attention focused upon it in a cinema. And I feel like it's the kind of movie that actually its natural habitat is on the small screen. So if you are interested in seeing Copshop, just wait a few weeks, because this is the kind of movie that should have gone straight to streaming. It should have gone straight to Netflix, like Carnahan's last several movies have, because it's made for living rooms, not for cinemas. If we are now going to start making value judgments about what movies go to streaming and what play in cinemas, I don't understand why this is in the latter, honestly, aside from Butler's star power, because really, at times, it felt very evocative of direct-to-video fare I've watched, where they kind of stretch things out for as long as possible to get to 90 minutes before finally delivering on the action in the last stretch of the movie, precisely like this one does. So, if you're a fan of old school action movies. Copshop might be worth a look. There are good things in it. Louder is definitely someone to keep an eye on in the future, and there are some good moments, some good shootouts, but for me, it felt like it was just simply stretched far too thinly. If you like this review, then take a shot at my Ko-fi page, or you can read Lock and Load at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.